Well, throughout this portion of First Timothy in chapter 5, as I mentioned yesterday and all of last week as well, is that Paul's focus is upon what must have been a major problem and challenge in the churches, and that was how do we take care of the widows in our midst. And one of the things, as kind of a governing principle he sets up here, is that when it comes to ministering to the needs of people, family is supposed to come first. You know, the old saying where charity begins at home. Well, that concept is taken out of the Bible. It says, that we need to be first and foremost in caring for our families. As he says in verse 8, if anyone does not provide for his relatives, especially for his immediate family, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So one of the things Paul found or really understood is a lot of blame could be attached to the church because they neglected those for whom they had first responsibility. Now, does that mean that we don't have responsibility to care for other people? Well, later on we find that John, in his first letter to the church in 1 John, he said that if we see somebody in need and we have the means of helping them or relieving their need, and we just ignore them and walk on, then we're behaving like an unbeliever. We've denied the love of God. And so it's not saying that we're excused from any kind of responsibility to care for others. In fact, the emphasis is pretty strong, but it says there's a priority. In the first place is to care for our family. So when I'm looking at my resources, I need to first think in terms of how can I allocate my resources to care for the needs of my immediate family and my relatives. And after that, I can look beyond it. But until I've addressed that issue, then I'm not free to take those same monies and just give them to somebody else. And I say this because I have known Christians who, well-meaning and such, but they really kind of neglected the welfare of their own families for that very reason. They felt like it was more meritorious in the eyes of God, I guess, if you were to cause deficiencies in your own home. And this is particularly true what I've seen in the ministry philosophies. Because yesterday I began by pointing out that when I first came into ministry, the thing that I was taught was that your first responsibility was God. Excuse me. Your second responsibility was towards the ministry, the church, and then your third responsibility was for your family. And I know that as a result of that, I spent a significantly larger amount of time doing God's work in the church, in the ministry. And what I was left over, really, as my wife told me at one point, she said, I feel like all I get is the leftovers. And as I thought about it, I thought, well, that's not only just a feeling, that's actually the way it works. You're getting me at the end of my day. So she said, here you are spending hours ministering and counseling and sharing with other people and doing visitations and funerals and weddings and on and on and on it went. And yet when you come home, you're exhausted mentally and physically, and there's really not really even any time left over to have family time. So it didn't work out well. It wasn't healthy for my wife or for my kids or for my marriage or anybody. And so it was really kind of an eye-opening thing when I came to this point in my life where I realized, wait a minute, that set of priorities is all jacked up and out of order. That the way it really should work is that God always comes first, but the first place we express our relationship with God is within our family setting, and then we can take it outside. In fact, when Paul's talking about the qualifications of spiritual leaders, do you realize that of the 21 things he lists in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus chapter 2, that though there's 21 qualifiers he puts on there, and 5 of them have to do with your family life, your family relationship. So the family is really supposed to be a prototypical example, the place kind of where you learn how to do ministry in the church, and rather than the other way around. That we learn to love each other in a practical and real way, and in a daily way, learning to love, forgive, to serve, to sacrifice, and so forth, first and foremost within our marriages, within our family life, with our children, and then we can extrapolate that out into the larger church and community. It's interesting that there's a rabbinical tradition that says that a man should not be allowed to be a rabbi until he was 40 years of age, or at least to be a teaching rabbi. He couldn't teach the Word of God because he hadn't had enough time to prove himself as being qualified, and secondly, he didn't have enough life experience to be able to share wisdom on the struggles and difficulties that life brings. I remember telling my sons that I said, you'll never get paid what you're worth until you're 40 years of age. And pretty much that's proven to be true across the board. And I find it fascinating because it's almost like there's a simple universal principle that God has created in the universe, that you have to reach a certain point in your life where you have the experience and the maturity to be able to handle great responsibilities. Well, I had a pretty stiff learning curve. My wife and I got married at 20, and I don't think I was qualified to do just about anything. But the point was, I think that when you realize that first responsibility is to your family, it changes the prioritization of your time and your energy. I'll never forget a good friend of mine, Justin Alfred, who was a pastor and staff at Costa Mesa with me. And I remember he was asked by Pastor Chuck to take on another teaching responsibility. And his response was, I'm already gone from my family 3 nights a week. I don't think it would be honoring to God if I were to take another night. And I remember how shocked I was, because I thought, first of all, you don't tell Chuck no. But secondly, I never heard anybody express that concept before. Because to me, you ask me, I'm ready, I'm there, I'll do whatever I need to do. And it was the first time I began to recognize that maybe that priority is in my life is not where it should be, and I need to focus more on spending time with my family. It's one of the reasons, actually, that I eventually left that ministry, because that ministry put so many excruciating demands on my time and energy that I really had no time for my family. I had very little time for even my wife. And so I say all of that, but basically hoping people will learn from my mistakes and become wiser. Because again, as we said, that the old adage that charity begins at home, I think has its foundations in the Bible. It's a principle that we should really be listening to. And it's something that at this point in my life, I'm desperately trying to make up for, to make sure that there are sacred times. My wife is always reminding me, she said, remember, this is your day off. And because I'm an inveterate studier and researcher, I just can't stop. But the whole point is that it's realizing that I need to step back from the unending demands of life and ministry and just simply say, I'm going to stop at this point. I think that's one of the wonderful things. When I was in a boarding school, it was a Seventh-day Adventist boarding school, and they wouldn't let us do homework from Friday night to Saturday night. And I liked that because it gave me an excuse not to do any work. But as I look back and I realized there's a certain value of the understanding of having a Sabbath in your life. And I don't think it has to be a Saturday or a Sunday or any particular day. But I think there has to be some point in your day-to-day life, in your weekly life, where you just simply pull back and you stop pushing so hard and you give your soul and your mind and your body a rest. Because God, who created us, rested the seventh day. And he did that for an example. And basically it's telling us we can't go unceasingly and unendingly, that we will get exhausted, we will burn out, and that will be the end of the story. There's this old saying where people used to say, I would rather burn out than rust out. The idea that I'm going to work so hard, and because if I don't, I'll just turn to a bag of rust. And I love what Chuck Swindoll said in response to that. He said, well, really, in the long run, what difference does that make? Either way, you're out. And he said, that's the whole point. You need to step back and take a break. And that's why I've learned over the years that it's just, no matter how pressing things are and how important things are, that the demands will never end. That there will never be a point where you can literally say, well, I've done enough. It's like the gentleman asked me sometime, he says, how do I know when I prayed enough? And I said, well, I don't really think there is such a thing. I think that just God has mercy on us at some point, because I can't pray 24/7. And so the reality is that we need to build those breaks into our lives. There needs to be an agreement between a husband and wife, and where you set aside a time and say, this is going to be our family time, and we're not going to allow that to be compromised by business or the other demands that are upon our life. And part of the thing I find sometimes is that there are wives and husbands, especially wives, who become so devoted to serving in the church that their family rarely sees them, and they are very fulfilled and satisfied in doing that. And I'd be the first to tell you that if it wasn't for women volunteering their time, effort, and energies, there would be very little in the church that ever got done. But at the same time, I would say, ladies, make sure that you're not neglecting your husband and your children. Sometimes you can enjoy escaping from the pressures of family and home, but it's always important to realize that the primary relationships in your life are your husbands, your wives, your children, and invest in them, because you won't have forever to do that. There will come a time where they will grow up, your children will grow up in particular, and have their own lives and their own busy schedules, and you want them to be dependent emotionally upon you and not just simply financially while they're young. Anyway, I hope this stuff makes sense. We'll continue tomorrow. Blessings.